December 7th, 1941, 7:55 a.m., Hawaiian time. As the first wave of Japanese aircraft screamed over Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya led his Zero fighters through smoke-choked skies, searching for American resistance. What he found instead were rows of grounded aircraft, many already burning from the initial assault. Among the flames sat several Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, their silver fuselages gleaming in the morning sun, their defensive guns silent and unmanned. Itaya made a mental note of these large American bombers as his Zero flashed past at 300 miles per hour. They looked formidable, certainly, but his intelligence briefings had assured him that American bomber defenses were primitive compared to what Japanese naval aviation had developed. The bombers carried perhaps 5 or 6 machine guns scattered around the fuselage, nothing that a skilled Zero pilot couldn't evade or overwhelm with aggressive tactics. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Itaya and his fellow pilots didn't know, what Japanese naval intelligence had completely failed to grasp, was that these grounded fortresses represented just the beginning of a defensive revolution. Within 18 months, Japanese fighter pilots would face not individual B-17s with scattered guns, but geometric formations of 27, 36, even 54 bombers flying in tight defensive boxes. Each aircraft would bristle with 10, 11, eventually 13 heavy machine guns, and when multiplied across an entire formation, these individual defensive weapons would combine into a single, devastating aerial weapon system capable of throwing 700 heavy-caliber bullets per second into the surrounding airspace. The mathematics of this firepower concentration would force Japanese tactical doctrine into crisis, shattering assumptions about bomber vulnerability that had guided fighter training since the 1930s. But in December 1941, as Japanese forces swept across the Pacific with stunning speed, capturing Wake Island, the Philippines, Singapore, and vast territories throughout Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies, that future remained hidden. Japanese pilots dominated the skies with their nimble Zero fighters and experienced naval aviators who had honed their skills over China since 1937. American resistance seemed scattered and disorganized, exactly as Japanese war planners had predicted. The few B-17s operating in the Philippines and Java flew individually or in small groups of 3 to 5 aircraft, easily intercepted by swarms of Japanese fighters. These early encounters reinforced Japanese confidence in their fighter tactics and their pilots' superior training. The Japanese Army Air Force and Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service had developed their tactical doctrines through years of combat over China, where they faced Soviet-supplied bombers with minimal defensive armament. Chinese Tupolev SB-2 bombers typically carried 3 or 4 machine guns of rifle caliber, 7.62 mm weapons that posed little threat to attacking fighters. Japanese pilots learned to press attacks aggressively, closing to within 200 yards or less before opening fire, confident that enemy defensive fire lacked the power or accuracy to seriously threaten them. This aggressive doctrine worked brilliantly in China and continued working in the early Pacific campaigns when Japanese fighters encountered scattered American bombers. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, who would become one of Japan's top-scoring aces with 64 confirmed victories, described his first encounter with a B-17 in his memoir, Samurai. The date was January 16, 1942, over Lae, New Guinea. Sakai and his wingman attacked a lone fortress from astern, the classic stern chase that Japanese pilots had perfected against Chinese bombers. They expected the American gunners to offer token resistance before the bomber either dove for the deck or attempted to escape into clouds. Instead, Sakai watched tracers from the tail position reach out toward his Zero with surprising accuracy. The 50 caliber rounds, far heavier than anything he'd faced over China, punched holes through his wing and shattered his canopy. He broke off the attack, shocked by the intensity and effectiveness of the defensive fire from what he'd been told was a poorly defended bomber. But even this early warning failed to prepare Japanese aviation for what was coming. Sakai had attacked a single B-17, facing perhaps 4 or 5 guns at most, depending on which direction he approached from. The defensive fire, while more intense than expected, remained manageable for an experienced pilot willing to press his attack, despite the tracers. What Japanese pilots couldn't yet imagine was facing not one fortress, but dozens flying in geometric formations specifically designed to concentrate their defensive firepower into interlocking fields of fire that covered every possible approach angle simultaneously. The evolution of American heavy bomber tactics in the Pacific theater followed a painful learning curve purchased with lives and aircraft. Early 1942 saw B-17s operating individually or in small groups by necessity rather than choice. The 5th Air Force in Australia and New Guinea simply lacked sufficient aircraft to mount large-scale formation missions. General George Brett, commanding Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, could field perhaps 15 to 20 operational B-17s at any given time during early 1942, with mechanical issues, battle damage, and the primitive maintenance facilities in Australia keeping many aircraft grounded. These small numbers forced American bombers to operate independently, making them vulnerable to the swarms of Japanese fighters that defended key bases at Rabaul, Lae, and throughout the Solomon Islands. Japanese fighter pilots racked up impressive victories against these scattered bombers throughout 1942. 0 pilots from the Tainan Air Group, the 4th Air Group, and other elite units developed reputations as bomber killers, perfecting their tactics against the lone fortresses that attempted to strike Japanese installations. The standard Japanese fighter approach involved multiple aircraft attacking simultaneously from different angles, overwhelming the bombers' defensive guns through sheer numbers and coordination. 3 or 4 Zeros would attack from the front quarter, while 2 more struck from below and behind, forcing the American gunners to divide their attention and their fire. This tactic worked effectively against individual bombers, downing dozens of B-17s during 1942 across the Pacific theater. But American bomber commanders were learning from these losses, studying after-action reports, interviewing surviving crews, and gradually developing the tactical solutions that would reverse the balance of air combat. The key insight came from European theater experience, where 8th Air Force B-17 groups facing German fighters had already discovered that tight defensive formations dramatically improved survival rates. Colonel Lawrence Cooter, who would later become Commanding General of 5th Air Force Bomber Operations, visited England in mid-1942 to observe 8th Air Force tactics. What he saw convinced him that formation flying offered the only viable solution to the fighter problem facing Pacific bombers. The defensive box formation, developed through trial and costly error over Europe, positioned bombers in a 3-dimensional geometric array that maximized mutual defensive fire support. A basic element consisted of 3 aircraft flying in close V formation, with the lead bomber slightly ahead and the 2 wing aircraft echeloned back and to either side. 3 such elements, stacked vertically with the second element slightly higher and the third higher still, formed a squadron box of 9 bombers. The vertical stacking meant that if Japanese fighters attacked from any angle, they faced guns from multiple bombers simultaneously, with fields of fire overlapping to create zones where defensive fire converged from several aircraft at once. 3 squadron boxes, positioned in trail with horizontal and vertical offsets, formed a group formation of 27 bombers. At this scale, the defensive geometry created something unprecedented in Pacific air combat. A Japanese fighter attempting to attack the formation from any angle would face concentrated fire from 6, 8, sometimes 10 different bombers, depending on the approach vector. The combined firepower transformed individual aircraft defenses into a collective weapon system far more lethal than the sum of its parts. The mathematics were straightforward but devastating. A B-17F model, the standard variant operating in the Pacific during 1942 and 1943, carried 10 Browning M2 machine guns of 50 caliber. These weapons fired at approximately 800 rounds per minute when properly maintained, generating 13.3 rounds per second per gun. 10 guns meant 133 heavy-caliber rounds per second from a single bomber, but in a 27-aircraft formation, the combined armament totaled 270 50-caliber machine guns. When multiple bombers engaged a single target, the defensive fire could reach 200, 300, even 400 rounds per second, converging on the attacking fighter from multiple angles simultaneously. Japanese fighter pilots had never encountered anything remotely comparable to this volume of fire. Their experience over China and during early Pacific operations involved attacking bombers that might put 20 or 30 rounds per second into the surrounding airspace at most. Suddenly, they faced defensive barrages 10 times more intense, with tracers converging from unexpected angles as bombers they hadn't even targeted joined the defensive fire. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the actual hit probability. The first squadron-strength B-17 formation mission in the Pacific Theater occurred on August 17, 1942, when elements of the 11th Bombardment Group struck Japanese installations at Kiska in the Aleutian Islands. 9 fortresses flew in a modified defensive box, each aircraft positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Japanese Zero fighters from the Ryujo Air Group intercepted the formation at 14,000 feet. What happened next would be documented in after-action reports that circulated through Japanese fighter units across the Pacific, generating both respect and concern. Warrant Officer Makoto Endo led a 3-plane Shotai, the basic Japanese fighter element, against the American formation. His tactical briefing had emphasized the fortress's vulnerable nose, where early B-17E models mounted only flexible guns operated by the bombardier and navigator. Endo executed a textbook head-on attack, diving from 20,000 feet to build speed, then pulling level for a gun run directly at the lead bomber's cockpit. His 2 wingmen followed in trail, preparing to exploit whatever damage the leader achieved. At 1,000 yards, Endo opened fire with his twin 20mm cannons and twin 7.7mm machine guns. The combined firepower should have shredded the bomber's plexiglass nose and killed or wounded the pilots. Instead, Endo watched his tracers converge on target, while defensive fire erupted from multiple bombers simultaneously. The lead fortress's nose guns fired back, as expected. But the top turret swung forward, adding its twin 50-caliber guns to the defense. Even more surprising, bombers flanking the lead aircraft joined the engagement, their gunners tracking Endo's Zero as it closed. What intelligence had described as facing 2 or 3 defensive guns became facing 8 or 10, all firing at once. The psychological shock was immediate and visceral. Endo had attacked bombers over China hundreds of times, rarely facing more than scattered return fire from unsynchronized positions. This was different. This was a wall of tracers converging from unexpected angles, creating a defensive barrage that seemed impossible to penetrate. He pressed his attack to 400 yards, close enough to see his rounds impacting the bomber's nose section, then broke hard left and dove away. His wingmen followed, abandoning their attack runs before reaching firing range. The formation continued to its target, unharmed. The after-action report filed by the Ryujo Air Group commander noted that American bombers flying in formation presented significantly greater defensive challenges than previously encountered. The report recommended coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously to overwhelm the gunners and divide their fire. But even this tactical adjustment assumed Japanese fighter units could mass sufficient numbers to execute such coordination. In the vast expanses of the Pacific Theater, with Japanese fighter strength spread across thousands of miles, defending hundreds of installations, achieving local numerical superiority often proved impossible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By mid-1943, as American bomber strength in the Pacific gradually increased, Japanese pilots faced formations of 18, 21, even 27 B-17s flying in disciplined combat boxes. The defensive firepower scaled geometrically rather than linearly. A 9-plane squadron box carried approximately 90-50 caliber machine guns if each bomber mounted 10 weapons. But the geometric positioning meant that a fighter attacking any single bomber faced fire from multiple aircraft simultaneously, with guns from 6, 8, sometimes 10 different bombers converging on the approach corridor. The mathematics were brutal from the attacker's perspective. A B-17's Browning M2 machine gun fired approximately 800 rounds per minute, or 13.3 rounds per second. If 10 bombers engaged a single attacking fighter simultaneously, which frequently occurred in tight formations, that represented 133 heavy-caliber rounds per second, filling the airspace around the target. At typical combat ranges of 400 to 800 yards, with engagement times lasting perhaps 3 to 5 seconds, a fighter pilot faced, flying through 400 to 650 caliber rounds during a single attack pass. Japanese fighter pilots began reporting phenomena they'd never encountered over China. Tracers seemed to fill the entire approach corridor from multiple angles, creating the illusion of impenetrable defensive fire. The sound of 50 caliber rounds passing close to the aircraft, a distinctive crack that differed from the lighter machine guns Japanese pilots were accustomed to hearing, became psychologically devastating. Pilots described instinctively flinching or breaking off attacks before reaching optimal firing range, their survival instincts overriding tactical discipline when faced with such concentrated fire. Lieutenant Yasuhiko Kuroe, flying with the 2nd Air Group based at Rabaul, described his first engagement with a B-17 formation in his diary entry dated November 3, 1942. 18 fortresses approached at 24,000 feet in a tight box formation. Kuroe's squadron, 12 Zeros, attacked from multiple directions in coordinated waves designed to overwhelm the defensive gunners. Kuroe approached from high frontal, the tactically preferred angle that Japanese doctrine emphasized for bomber attacks. What he encountered shattered his assumptions about American defensive capabilities. As Kuro's Zero closed from 12 o'clock high at a combined speed exceeding 500 miles per hour, defensive tracers reached out from the entire formation, not just his target bomber. He counted at least 6 different tracer streams converging on his approach path, each representing 2 guns firing in unison from turrets and positions throughout the formation. The visual impact was overwhelming, making accurate aim nearly impossible while simultaneously trying to avoid the incoming fire. Kuroe fired a 3-second burst from his cannons at approximately 500 yards, far beyond his weapon's effective range, then broke away without observing any hits. The squadron claimed 2 fortresses destroyed in the engagement, but reconnaissance the following day showed all 18 bombers had continued to their target and dropped their ordnance. The reality of these engagements often contradicted pilot claims, a phenomenon common to all air forces during the war. Gun camera footage, when available, frequently showed rounds impacting bombers without bringing them down. The fortress's legendary structural toughness, allowing them to absorb damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. Japanese intelligence officers analyzing combat reports from units across the Pacific identified a disturbing pattern through late 1942 and early 1943. B-17 formations were proving significantly more difficult to intercept successfully than any previous bomber type. Loss rates among Japanese fighters attempting interceptions exceeded 10% per engagement in some cases. Unsustainable numbers for air groups that already faced maintenance challenges and limited replacement aircraft. Meanwhile, American bomber loss rates remained below 5% on most missions, occasionally dipping to 2 or 3% when fighter escort was available. The captured B-17D at Clark Field in the Philippines, recovered after the American evacuation, provided Japanese engineers their first opportunity to examine the fortress's defensive armament in detail. The aircraft, rebuilt from wreckage left behind by retreating American forces, flew to Japan in mid-1942 for comprehensive testing at Fusa Airfield near Tokyo. Major Kazuyuki Saito led the evaluation team, conducting extensive ground and flight testing between June and December 1942. Saito's reports to Japanese Army Air Force headquarters emphasized several points that contradicted pre-war assessments of American bomber capabilities. First, the .50 caliber Browning machine gun proved far more effective than Japanese intelligence had predicted. With muzzle velocities exceeding 2,800 feet per second and projectile weights of 46 grams, these weapons delivered kinetic energy comparable to Japanese 13mm heavy machine guns, while maintaining excellent accuracy at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. The armor-piercing ammunition could penetrate standard zero armor plate at combat ranges, making head-on attacks far more dangerous than Japanese tactical doctrine acknowledged. Second, the gun positions offered excellent fields of fire with minimal blind spots. The Sperry ball turret, operated by a gunner compressed into an impossibly cramped sphere beneath the bomber's belly, could track targets through 360 degrees of azimuth and nearly 90 degrees of elevation. No attack angle from being below escaped coverage. The tail turret, mounted in a powered Cheyenne installation, commanded complete coverage aft, with no blind spots within 30 degrees of the tail axis. Even the flexible waist guns, operated by gunners standing at open windows, provided overlapping coverage that left few gaps in the defensive envelope. Third, and most importantly, Saito's testing revealed that the bomber's defensive effectiveness multiplied dramatically when flying in formation. Solo test flights showed the B-17 to be a tough but manageable target for skilled Zero pilots. But simulated attacks against multiple bombers flying in geometric arrays demonstrated that defensive fire concentrated in ways that made successful attacks extraordinarily difficult. A fighter approaching any single bomber in the formation faced guns from multiple aircraft, creating crossfire that forced pilots to either abort attacks or press through sustained defensive barrages. The implications troubled Japanese tactical planners, who understood what these findings meant for future operations. If American bomber formations generated this level of defensive firepower with 18 or 27 aircraft, what would happen when formations expanded to 50 or 100 bombers? The mathematics suggested defensive capabilities that would make interception prohibitively expensive in fighter losses, yet intelligence reports indicated American bomber production rates could sustain exactly such large-scale operations. By 1943, the reality Saito's reports predicted began manifesting across the Pacific Theater. The 13th Air Force, operating from bases in the Solomon Islands, routinely fielded formations of 27 B-17s for strikes against Rabaul, Bougainville, and other Japanese strongholds. The 5th Air Force in New Guinea could mass 36 fortresses when required for maximum effort missions. Each escalation in formation size corresponded to increased defensive firepower that Japanese fighters struggled to overcome. Consider the specific numbers for a 36 aircraft formation: 3 squadron boxes stacked in the standard combat wing configuration, 36 B-17F models, each mounting 10 .50 caliber machine guns, provided 360 defensive weapons total. But the effective firepower exceeded simple multiplication because geometric positioning created zones where multiple aircraft could engage single targets. A fighter attacking from frontal angles might face fire from 12 to 15 different bombers simultaneously, representing 24 to 30 heavy machine guns firing at once. That translated to 320 to 400 rounds per second converging on the approach corridor. Japanese fighter pilots described these formations as fortresses, in a different sense than Americans intended with the bomber's nickname. The defensive geometry created something analogous to a medieval castle, with overlapping fields of fire covering every approach and mutual support, eliminating vulnerable points. Breaking through required either overwhelming numbers, exceptional skill and courage, or tactical innovations that Japanese fighter doctrine hadn't yet developed. The most effective tactic remained the high-speed head-on attack from 12 o'clock high, diving from altitude to build speed, then pulling up into a climbing gun run that targeted the cockpit. This approach minimized exposure time to defensive fire and exploited the nose's weaker armament compared to other angles. But executing such attacks required ice-cold nerves and precise timing. The combined closing speed of fighter and bomber exceeded 500 miles per hour, giving pilots perhaps 2 seconds of firing time before breaking away to avoid collision. During those 2 seconds, defensive gunners from multiple bombers fired continuously, creating a gauntlet of 50 caliber rounds that the attacking pilot had to fly through while maintaining aim on his target. Lieutenant Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who would become one of Japan's top aces with 87 confirmed victories, described the experience in a 1943 letter to his family that was recovered post-war. "Attacking American heavy bombers requires different mentality than fighting their fighters," he wrote. "With fighters, you can maneuver, use speed and position to gain advantage. Against bombers in formation, you must accept that you will fly through defensive fire regardless of your skill. The question becomes whether your courage lasts long enough to press the attack home before survival instinct makes you break away." This psychological dimension proved as significant as the physical reality of the defensive firepower. Gun camera footage analyzed post-war showed that many Japanese pilots broke off attacks at ranges exceeding 600 yards, well beyond their weapons' effective range, simply because the volume of defensive fire created an overwhelming sense of danger. The human brain, wired through millions of years of evolution to avoid obvious threats, rebelled against flying deliberately into walls of tracers. Training and discipline could override these instincts temporarily, but mission after mission facing such defensive fire ground down even the most experienced pilot's willingness to press attacks aggressively. The captured B-17 testing at Fusa also revealed another uncomfortable truth for Japanese planners. American manufacturing quality exceeded Japanese industrial capabilities by significant margins. The fortress's construction demonstrated sophisticated production techniques that allowed mass manufacturing without sacrificing quality. Components fit together with precision tolerances. Riveting showed consistent quality throughout the airframe. Systems integration reflected careful engineering that prioritized reliability and maintainability. Everything about the bomber's construction suggested an industrial capacity that could produce these complex aircraft in quantities Japanese factories couldn't match. Major Saito's final report to headquarters, submitted in January 1943, concluded with an assessment that proved prophetic. "The fortress represents American industrial philosophy, made manifest," he wrote. "Every design decision prioritizes production volume and operational effectiveness over individual craftsmanship. The defensive armament, while not individually superior to our weapons, becomes devastatingly effective through systematic application in mass formations. We must assume American forces will continue expanding their bomber fleets, and that future formations will exceed current sizes significantly. Our fighter tactics must evolve accordingly, or interception losses will become unsustainable. That evolution never fully materialized. Japanese fighter production, hampered by increasingly severe resource shortages and constant American attacks on industrial facilities, couldn't replace combat losses quickly enough to maintain experienced units at strength. Pilot training programs, cut from 9 months to 3 months as the war situation deteriorated, produced replacement pilots who lacked the skill to execute the complex tactics required to successfully engage B-17 formations. By mid-1944, many Japanese fighter squadrons consisted primarily of novice pilots with fewer than 50 flight hours, facing American formations protected by experienced gunners and increasingly sophisticated tactics. The 54 plane-wing combat box, developed by 8th Air Force units in Europe and adopted by Pacific Theater units in late 1943, represented the ultimate expression of formation defensive firepower. 54 B-17s, each mounting between 10 and 13 50 caliber machine guns depending on the variant, generated total armament exceeding 600 defensive weapons. The geometric positioning meant that approaching this formation from any angle exposed attacking fighters to concentrated fire from 15 to 25 different bombers simultaneously. The mathematics became genuinely prohibitive from the attacker's perspective. 20 bombers engaging a single target represented 40 heavy machine guns firing at once, generating approximately 530 rounds per second. At typical engagement ranges and speeds, a fighter pilot attempting to press an attack through this defensive fire faced approximately 1,500 to 2,050 caliber rounds during a 3-second gun run. The probability of taking hits approached statistical certainty, making successful attacks dependent more on luck than skill. Japanese after-action reports from late 1943 missions against such formations documented the brutal reality. The 11th Air Fleet, defending Rabaul against repeated American attacks, reported fighter losses exceeding 15% per major engagement by November 1943. Some missions saw 20 Japanese fighters intercepting formations of 36 American bombers, achieving perhaps 1 or 2 bomber kills while losing 4 or 5 fighters. The exchange ratios were unsustainable for Japanese forces, operating with fixed numbers of replacement aircraft and pilots, while American losses were replaced within weeks by fresh bombers and crews flowing through the training pipeline. Wing Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most innovative tacticians and the principal planner for the Pearl Harbor attack, analyzed the defensive formation problem in a December 1943 tactical memorandum. "We face an opponent who has solved bomber vulnerability through mathematics and geometry," he wrote. "Individual American bombers remain vulnerable to skilled attack. But formations of 20, 30, 50 aircraft transform individual vulnerabilities into collective strength through mutual support. Our fighters cannot achieve local numerical superiority sufficient to overwhelm such formations without abandoning defense of other critical areas. We are being forced into an unwinnable equation, where every tactical solution creates strategic vulnerabilities elsewhere." The statistical reality of the defensive firepower problem manifested most clearly during the Rabaul campaign of late 1943 and early 1944. Between November 1943 and March 1944, Japanese forces at Rabaul lost approximately 359 aircraft, many to the concentrated defensive fire of American bomber formations that grew progressively larger as additional squadrons deployed to forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul had mustered approximately 300 aircraft and 1,500 aircrewmen in early 1943, numbers that seemed adequate when American bomber raids consisted of 6 or 9 fortresses. But as formations expanded to 18, 27, 36 aircraft, Japanese fighter losses accelerated beyond sustainable rates. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, operations officer for the 2nd Air Group at Rabaul, documented the defensive firepower problem in his operational diary during December 1943. On December 17th, his unit intercepted a formation of 27 B-17s, escorted by P-38 Lightning fighters, striking Vunakanau airfield. 23 Zeros engaged the formation, achieving what pilots claimed as 4 bomber kills. Post-mission reconnaissance showed all bombers had reached their target and dropped ordnance. Actual losses were 0 American bombers and 2 Zeros confirmed destroyed, with 4 additional Zeros damaged, requiring extensive repair. The exchange ratio was unsustainable. Nakajima's analysis identified the core problem. Japanese pilots reported that pressing attacks against the bomber or formation to within 300 yards, the range necessary for their 20mm cannons to achieve reliable hits, required flying through concentrated defensive fire that averaged 3 to 5 seconds duration. During those seconds, pilots estimated facing between 30 and 50 heavy machine guns firing simultaneously from multiple bombers. The probability of taking hits approached certainty at these ranges, making successful attacks dependent on luck rather than skill. Pilots who survived multiple missions against such formations developed understandable reluctance to press attacks aggressively, preferring to fire from longer ranges where defensive fire intensity decreased but hit probability dropped correspondingly. The captured B-17 testing at Fusa had predicted this outcome with uncomfortable accuracy. By fall 1943, all 3 captured fortresses had been moved to Fusa Airfield near Tokyo for continued evaluation. Japanese test pilots flying simulated intercepts against these aircraft confirmed that formation defensive fire created zones where successful attacks required either overwhelming numerical superiority or acceptance of prohibitive casualty rates. The reports recommended tactical innovations, including standoff weapons, coordinated multi-direction attacks, and concentration on isolated bombers that strayed from formations. But implementing these tactics required resources Japanese forces increasingly lacked. By late 1944, Japanese Navy pilots graduated with approximately 40 hours flight time, compared to 525 hours for their American counterparts. The average Japanese Navy pilot's flight experience had dropped from 700 hours at war's outbreak to just 275 hours by January 1945. These poorly trained replacement pilots lacked the skill to execute the complex tactics required to successfully engage B-17 formations. Many died on their first or second combat missions, shot down by defensive fire before achieving any successes against the bombers. The contrast with American training programs proved devastating for Japanese air power. American pilots received continuously upgraded training from combat veterans, rotated back to instructor positions, creating institutional learning that preserved hard-won lessons. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, remained in combat until killed, captured, or physically unable to continue flying, preventing experienced aviators from training replacements. This philosophical difference reflected divergent strategic realities. America's industrial capacity could sustain systematic crew rotation. Japan's increasingly desperate situation required every capable pilot flying combat missions, regardless of long-term consequences. The tactical implications extended beyond simple mathematics of defensive firepower. American bomber formations developed sophisticated coordination between aircraft that Japanese intelligence struggled to counter. Lead bombers controlled formation, navigation, and bombing, allowing following aircraft to concentrate on defensive positioning. Designated Pathfinder aircraft marked targets with smoke or incendiaries, improving bombing accuracy while the formation maintained tight defensive geometry. Communication systems allowed gunners to coordinate fire, with turret operators calling out threats and directing multiple aircraft to engage priority targets simultaneously. Japanese fighter pilots discovered that breaking up these formations required disrupting the lead aircraft, forcing following bombers to scatter and become vulnerable to individual attacks. But lead bombers typically occupied the formation's center, the most heavily defended position where converging fire from surrounding aircraft created virtually impenetrable defensive zones. Attacking the formation's edges offered better survival odds but achieved minimal tactical results, as the majority of bombers continued to target and bombed accurately. The B-17G model, entering Pacific service in limited numbers during late 1943, compounded the defensive firepower problem. The G variant mounted 1350 caliber machine guns, including a new chin turret specifically designed to counter frontal attacks. This additional armament eliminated the nose's vulnerability that Japanese pilots had exploited with frontal attacks. Suddenly, the tactically preferred approach angle became as heavily defended as other vectors, forcing Japanese fighter doctrine into another adaptation cycle when the training system and resources to implement new tactics no longer existed. Wing Commander Minoru Genda's December 1943 assessment proved prophetic. By February 1944, sustained Allied bombing had destroyed so many aircraft at Rabaul that Japanese forces withdrew their surviving planes to Truk, effectively conceding the airspace over one of their most important Pacific strongholds. The withdrawal represented not tactical defeat in specific engagements but strategic collapse caused by unsustainable attrition rates against formations whose defensive firepower exceeded Japanese capacity to counter effectively. The 54-plane wing combat box, when fully implemented in the Pacific theater during 1944, represented the ultimate expression of everything Japanese pre-war planning had failed to anticipate. This formation fielded upwards of 700 heavy-caliber defensive machine guns total, creating a formidable defense against fighters. 750 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 13 rounds per second, generated a theoretical defensive firepower of 9,100 rounds per second across the entire formation. While actual engagement never involved all guns firing simultaneously, the geometric positioning ensured that any attack angle faced fire from 15-30 different bombers, representing 200 to 400 rounds per second converging on the approach corridor. Japanese fighter pilots described attacking these massive formations as flying into storms of steel. The visual impact of hundreds of tracers arcing through the sky from multiple directions, combined with the sound of 50 caliber rounds cracking past the cockpit and the sight of squadron mates spiraling down in flames, created psychological conditions that even the most experienced pilots struggled to overcome. Many attacks failed not because defensive fire actually hit the attacking fighters, but because pilots broke off prematurely, their survival instincts overwhelming tactical discipline when faced with such overwhelming firepower displays. The strategic implications extended beyond specific engagement outcomes. Japanese forces regarded the B-17 as the most feared and respected American aircraft during the early stages of the Pacific War. Recognition that reflected both the bomber's rugged construction and its devastating defensive capabilities when properly employed in formation. But fear and respect didn't translate to effective countermeasures when Japanese industrial capacity couldn't produce sufficient fighters. Fuel shortages, limited training and operations, and the training system produced replacement pilots with inadequate skills to execute complex tactics. By mid-1944, American bomber formations operated over Japanese-held territory with relative impunity in many sectors. Fighter interceptions still occurred, casualties still mounted, individual missions still faced determined resistance. But the overall trend showed declining Japanese effectiveness against bomber formations that continued growing larger and more sophisticated. Japan's supply of skilled pilots had become so limited by 1944 that flight instructors were reassigned from training units to combat operations, a desperate measure that addressed immediate personnel shortages while guaranteeing future capability collapse. The final irony of the defensive firepower equation was that it worked almost exactly as American pre-war doctrine predicted, just not in the way planners envisioned. Initially, formations were created in keeping with pre-war Air Corps doctrine that massed bombers could attack and destroy targets in daylight without fighter escort, relying on interlocking fire from their defensive machine guns. Over Europe, this doctrine failed catastrophically, with unescorted bomber formations suffering unsustainable losses to German fighters until long-range escorts became available in 1944. But against Japanese opposition in the Pacific, where fighter pilot training declined precipitously and resource constraints limited interception capabilities, the formation defensive firepower achieved the deterrent effect doctrine predicted. The captured B-17s that Japanese forces so carefully studied at Fusa revealed all the technical details that evaluation teams documented in comprehensive reports. They understood the gun positions, the fields of fire, the ammunition capacity, the manufacturing quality that enabled mass production. What the captured aircraft couldn't reveal was the systemic American advantages in industrial capacity, training infrastructure, and strategic depth that transformed individual bomber defensive capabilities into formation-level superiority Japanese forces couldn't match. Major Saito's final assessment in January 1943 had warned that future American formations would exceed current sizes significantly and that Japanese tactics must evolve accordingly. 18 months later, those predictions manifested with 54 plane formations fielding 700 defensive guns. But the tactical evolution Saito recommended never materialized. Japanese fighter units in late 1944 looked remarkably similar to units in early 1942, flying similar aircraft with similar tactics. Only the pilot experience levels had changed, dropping from elite to barely adequate as the war ground through Japan's irreplaceable pool of skilled aviators. The mathematics of defensive firepower that surprised Japanese pilots in their first encounters with B-17 formations in 1942 never changed. What changed was scale. 6 bombers with 60 guns became 18 bombers, with 180 guns became 54 bombers with 700 guns. The progression continued until American bomber formations dominated Pacific skies through sheer weight of defensive fire, making interception prohibitively expensive for Japanese forces, operating with fixed resources against opponents who could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.